I won $460,000 in the lottery, and my stepfather, who kicked me out at 18, showed up, demanding $200,000 to save his failing business. This is how it ended. I need to start this story back when I was 14, because nothing that happened later makes sense without it. My name is Melanie Ashworth. I'm 29 now. I work as a senior accountant at a mid-sized logistics firm outside Columbus. And up until 11 months ago, I would have told you my childhood was just complicated. The kind of thing you shrug off at parties when someone asks about your family. I don't shrug it off anymore. My father died when I was 11, a heart attack at 44 that none of us saw coming, and he left my mother the house free and clear, a modest 3-bedroom colonial on Larkspur Avenue that he'd spent his whole adult life paying down so that she'd never have to worry about a roof over her head. 3 years later, my mother married Roger Callahan, a landscaping contractor with a booming laugh and a habit of calling every woman sweetheart until the ring was on her finger, and within a month of moving in, he sat me down at the kitchen table my father had built with his own hands and told me the new rules. My house, my rules, he said, like the deed hadn't been transferred into my mother's name the week after the funeral, like he'd built the walls himself. I was to call him sir. I had an 8 o'clock curfew on school nights, 9 on weekends, non-negotiable, and if I broke it, there would be consequences he didn't bother specifying because the vagueness was the point. My mother sat beside him and said nothing. She had a way, even back then, of going quiet in a room and letting her silence do the agreeing for her, and I spent years mistaking that silence for weakness instead of what I now understand it to be, which was a choice repeated daily to keep the peace with Roger rather than stand between him and me. There's a specific memory I keep coming back to from that first year, a rainy October afternoon when I was 14 and still naive enough to think things might settle down once everyone got used to each other. I'd left my sneakers by the back door instead of in the mudroom, a mistake so small I didn't even register it as a mistake, and Roger held a 15-minute lecture at dinner about respect for shared spaces while my mother pushed peas around her plate and my little cousin, who was visiting that weekend, stared at the tablecloth like she wished she could disappear into it. Nobody said anything when he finally stopped talking. That was the pattern that repeated itself for the next 4 years. Not screaming, not violence, just a slow, relentless narrowing of what I was allowed to take up space for, punctuated by moments where I'd catch my mother watching me with something that looked almost like sadness before she looked away again. When I turned 16, Roger called another family meeting, this one about money. He told me I was a financial burden on the household, that groceries and electricity didn't pay for themselves, and that starting the following month I would be contributing $300 rent. I remember laughing at first because I thought it was a joke, and I remember the way his face didn't move at all, not even a flicker, and I understood it wasn't. I got a job at a Wendy's off Route 40, 20 hours a week during the school year, 30 in the summer, closing shifts that ended at 11 on nights when I had an AP chemistry test the next morning, coming home smelling like fry oil to finish homework at the kitchen table after everyone else had gone to bed because that was the only hour the house was quiet enough to think in. My manager at the time, a woman named Carla, who was maybe 10 years older than me and had 2 kids of her own, was the first adult outside my family who ever asked me point blank if everything was okay at home, and I remember lying to her without hesitation because admitting the truth felt like it would make it more real than I could handle at 16. Carla let me take home the day-old buns nobody was going to sell anyway, never said why, just started bagging them up at the end of my shifts, and looking back now, I think she knew exactly what was going on and simply did the only thing within her power to help. My mother told me once, quietly, while folding laundry, that it would teach me responsibility. I didn't say what I was thinking, which was that most 16-year-olds learn responsibility from a part-time job they get to keep the money from, not one that gets handed directly to their stepfather in a manila envelope every first of the month. 2 weeks after I graduated high school, Roger gave me 30 days to find somewhere else to live. He said he and my mother needed their privacy now that I was an adult, said it standing in the doorway of my own bedroom with his arms crossed while I was still in my cap and gown photos on the dresser behind him. My mother didn't argue. She waited until he'd gone out to the garage and pressed $200 into my hand, folded into quarters, and told me to be careful. And that was the last real thing she ever did for me before everything that came after. I sat in the driveway for a long time after that, in the used Corolla I'd bought myself with warehouse money the year before, watching the house I grew up in through the windshield, the porch light my father had installed the summer before he died still burning yellow over the front steps, and I made myself a promise that I've kept every day since, which was that I would never again let my sense of safety depend on how another person felt about me on a given afternoon. I rented a room from a widow named Dottie Whitfield, who lived 2 towns over, a woman in her 70s with a house full of ceramic birds and a heart bigger than the rent she charged me, which was less than market rate because, as she put it, she liked having someone young around to help carry the groceries in. I worked full-time at a distribution warehouse stacking pallets on the overnight shift and took night classes at the community college, 1 class at a time, sometimes 2 if the schedule allowed, for 6 years until I had an associate's degree and then a bachelor's in accounting from a state school I finished largely online. I got my first real job as a junior bookkeeper at 24, worked my way up, and by 27 I'd saved enough for a down payment on a 1-bedroom condo 40 minutes from where I grew up, a condo I furnished diminished slowly, piece by piece, with money I earned, and never once with money that came from my mother or Roger. I want to be clear that I didn't build a wall around myself during those years out of spite. I called my mother every Sunday. I sent her flowers on her birthday. I showed up for Thanksgiving most years, sat at the far end of the table from Roger, made small talk about his golf handicap, and drove home afterward with a headache that had nothing to do with traffic. I simply stopped expecting Roger to be anything other than what he'd already shown me he was, and I kept my distance from him the way you'd keep your distance from a stove you already knew was hot. Somewhere around my 25th birthday, I stopped even bothering to hope he'd apologize for any of it. Not because I'd made peace with what happened, but because I'd finally accepted that the apology was never coming. And once I stopped waiting for it, a weight I hadn't fully realized I was carrying started to lift. Then, in October of last year, I won the lottery. Not the eye-popping, quit your job forever kind of jackpot, but a genuinely life-changing amount. $460,000 after taxes on a $100 scratch ticket I bought on a whim at a gas station because the woman in line ahead of me was buying one. And I thought, why not? I sat in my car in that gas station parking lot for 20 minutes just staring at the numbers, hands shaking, before I called anyone at all. And the first person I called wasn't my mother. It was my best friend from college, a woman named Jasmine, who I'd met in that first accounting class I took at 22 and who had watched me build my entire adult life from the ground up over the years that followed. She screamed so loudly through the phone that a man walking past my car actually stopped and looked in the window. And once she'd calmed down enough to form full sentences, the very first thing she said before congratulations, before anything else, was, "Please don't tell Roger," which tells you everything you need to know about how well the people closest to me understood the shape of that particular danger. I laughed it off at the time, told her I wasn't stupid, that of course I'd handle it carefully, and some part of me already knew, with a kind of dread I couldn't name yet, that telling my mother meant telling Roger, and telling Roger meant this wasn't going to stay simple for long. I did tell my mother eventually, 2 days later, over coffee at her kitchen table, the same table Roger had once used to lay down his rules, and I made her promise not to say a word to him, not because I thought she'd betray me on purpose, but because I knew how she operated under pressure, how thin her resistance wore when Roger wanted something. She promised. That night, she told him anyway. I found out because Roger called me the next morning, his voice syrupy in a way I didn't recognize, congratulating me, telling me how proud he was, how the whole family should celebrate together, and I felt something in my stomach drop because I understood immediately what celebrate together was going to mean. I hung up the phone and sat on my kitchen floor for a while, back against the cabinets, doing the math in my head on how fast a secret could travel through a house where I no longer lived, and I realized it had probably taken less than 12 hours from my mother's promise to Roger's phone call, which told me everything I needed to know about how this was going to go from that point forward. I'd already done the responsible things by then. I paid off the remaining balance on my condo. I bought a reliable used Honda to replace the car with 190,000 miles on it that had been dying by inches for 2 years. I put 100,000 into a high-yield savings account and a modest index fund, and I donated $5,000 to a homeless shelter downtown that had helped a friend of mine get back on his feet a few years earlier. I was, for the first time in my adult life, financially secure in a way that felt less like luck and more like the payoff of a decade of scraping by, and I intended to keep it that way. Roger asked to meet me for dinner at a diner near my office, said it would be nice to catch up, just the two of us, and against every instinct I had, I agreed, mostly because I wanted to see his face when I told him what I was about to tell him. He was waiting in a booth when I arrived, wearing a golf shirt I recognized from a decade ago, and he didn't waste time on pleasantries. He told me his landscaping company, the one he'd run for almost 20 years, was drowning, that a big commercial contract had fallen through and equipment loans were coming due, and that he needed $200,000 to keep it afloat. He said it like it was a foregone conclusion, like he was informing me of a decision rather than making a request. I reminded him, as calmly as I could manage, that he'd charged me rent at 16 and put me out on the street 2 weeks after my high school graduation, and he waved his hand like he was swatting a fly, told me I was being childish, that keeping score over ancient history wasn't attractive in a grown woman, and that as the head of the household, he'd always had the right to make financial decisions for the family, including, apparently, decisions about money I hadn't even won yet at the time he was supposedly the head of anything. He leaned across the table at one point, close enough that I could smell the coffee on his breath, and told me that family meant sacrifice, that he'd sacrificed plenty for me over the years. And I asked him, genuinely curious by that point rather than angry, to name one single sacrifice he'd ever made on my behalf. And he couldn't. He just sat back and said I was twisting his words, which was as close to an admission as I was ever going to get out of him. When I told him no, flatly, without raising my voice, he slammed his hand on the table hard enough that the silverware jumped, muttered something about ingratitude, and walked out without paying for his coffee. I knew right then this wasn't over, so I did the only thing that made sense to me, which was to get organized before he could. I hired a family law attorney named Vanessa Cole, who came recommended by a coworker, and a financial advisor named Marcus Webb, who helped me restructure my accounts, remove Roger's name from every beneficiary designation my mother had apparently added him 2 years ago without telling me, and set up protections around the winnings that made them much harder to access, guilt, or litigate against. Marcus was blunt with me in our first meeting in a way I appreciated more than he probably realized, telling me me he'd seen this exact scenario play out with other clients who came into sudden money, that family members who'd shown no interest in a person's well-being for years had a way of rediscovering their affection the moment a windfall appeared, and that the single biggest mistake people made was waiting too long to protect themselves because they felt guilty about being prepared. I didn't feel guilty. I felt, for the first time in a long time, like I was finally a step ahead of Roger instead of 3 steps behind him. For about 2 weeks, Roger tried charm. He called twice, his voice warm and reasonable, said he understood if $200,000 felt like too much, and that $50,000 would really help just to get through the next few months. And when I said no to that too, the warmth evaporated in about 4 seconds flat, and he told me I'd regret cutting off family when I needed them most. A threat that would have almost been funny if it weren't so predictable. My mother, meanwhile, started texting me constantly, a slow drip of guilt dressed up as concern. She'd write things like, "Roger built half his life around that house. Don't you think you owe him something? And I raised you. Doesn't that count for anything?" And I started screenshotting every message because some instinct told me I'd need a record of exactly how this pressure campaign was being run. One night, she called me crying, actually crying, saying Roger had been sleeping in the guest room for a week and that the stress of it all was making her sick. And for about 30 seconds, I felt the old pull to fix things for her, the way I'd spent my whole childhood trying to, before I reminded myself that her marital problems with a man who'd charged his stepdaughter rent were not, in fact, my emergency to solve. Then Roger showed up at my office. I found out from the front desk, who called me in a mild panic to say there was a man in the lobby refusing to leave, insisting he was my father and that I owed him money. By the time I got downstairs, he was shouting loud enough that people from 2 other companies on the floor had come out to see what was happening, and my office manager, a woman named Priya, who I barely knew outside of hallway small talk, stood next to me the entire time and eventually told him plainly that if he didn't leave the building, she would call the police, at which point he finally stormed out, though not before knocking a potted plant off the reception desk on his way. Priya helped me sweep up the dirt and broken ceramic afterward, not saying much, just working quietly beside me, and when we finished, she squeezed my shoulder and said, "You don't owe that man an explanation for anything," which was such a small thing to say, and somehow exactly what I needed to hear right then. That was the moment I stopped feeling guilty about any of what came next. Vanessa drafted a formal cease and desist letter, laying out in precise legal language that Roger was to have no further contact with me, directly or through intermediaries, regarding money, my winnings, or anything else, and that any further harassment would be met with a restraining order request. For about a week, things went quiet, and I actually let myself believe it was over. Then Roger called again, and this time there was no charm left in his voice at all, just pure fury, and he told me he was going to sue me for every dollar he'd spent raising me between the ages of 14 and 18. Room and board, clothing, food, all of it, with interest, because apparently in his mind, the rent he'd charged a teenager working fast food had been generous rather than exploitative. I happened to have my phone recording that call because I'd started recording all of them the moment the office incident happened, and I sent the audio straight to Vanessa, who told me, with what I can only describe as barely restrained amusement, that his threat had no legal foundation whatsoever, since parents in our state have an affirmative legal obligation to support minor children and cannot retroactively bill them for having done the bare minimum. Around this time, I finally told a coworker named Derek what was going on, someone I'd sat 2 desks from for 3 years without ever really opening up to about my family, and he surprised me by taking it more seriously than almost anyone else in my life had, checking in with me most mornings, telling me flatly that none of what Roger was doing was normal, and that I had every right to protect myself, and having someone in my corner who wasn't being paid by the hour made a bigger difference than I expected. Derek had grown up with his own version of a difficult step-parent, though nowhere near as extreme as mine, and he understood in a way most of my other friends couldn't quite reach the particular exhaustion of having to justify over and over why you weren't willing to bankroll someone who'd made your childhood miserable. He started leaving a coffee on my desk most mornings without saying anything about it, just set it down and kept walking, and it became this small, steady thing I could count on during a stretch of months when almost nothing else felt steady at all. Then things took a turn I genuinely hadn't anticipated. Roger had a longtime business partner, a man named Walter Grimes, who I'd met maybe 3 times over the years at family barbecues, and out of nowhere, Walter called me directly, his voice low like he was worried about being overheard, and told me Roger had been quietly moving money out of accounts he shouldn't have had access to, including one connected to my mother, and that he thought I should know because, in his words, somebody's going to end up holding the bag and I don't think it should be you. That call sent me digging through public property records that same night, and what I found made my stomach turn over. Roger had filed an application to take out a $75,000 mortgage against the house on Larkspur Avenue, my father's house, the one he'd worked his whole life to pay off free and clear, so my mother would always have somewhere safe to live, using it as collateral to prop up his failing business without, as far as I could tell, my mother's full understanding of what she was signing. The only reason it didn't go through was that Roger's personal credit was bad enough that the bank denied the application outright. A small mercy that felt less like luck and more like the first piece of actual justice in this whole saga. I called Walter back a few days later to thank him properly, and he told me, almost apologetically, that he'd stayed quiet about Roger's business practices for years longer than he should have because he needed the partnership to survive survive financially himself, but that watching Roger try to gamble away a dead man's house was the line he couldn't cross in good conscience. I appreciated the honesty, even if it came with its own asterisk, and I forwarded everything he told me straight to Vanessa, who added it to the growing file she was keeping on Roger's pattern of behavior, in case any of it became relevant later. Around this same period, I started seeing a therapist, Dr. Elaine Foster, mostly because Vanessa had gently suggested that fighting a legal and financial battle with your own family without any emotional support was a recipe for burnout, and those sessions ended up reshaping how I understood my mother more than anything else in this story. I'd spent years telling myself she was simply passive, too conflict-averse to stand up to Roger, a victim of circumstance in her own home. Dr. Foster asked me gently what evidence I actually had for that story versus the alternative one, which was that my mother had, over and over across 15 years, made an active choice to protect her marriage and her own comfort over protecting me, and once she framed it that way, I couldn't unsee it. My mother wasn't weak. She was choosing every single time, and she just happened to keep choosing him. Dr. Foster asked me once what I thought my mother was actually afraid of losing if she ever stood up to Roger, and I sat with that question for almost the entire session before I landed on an answer, which was that I thought she was afraid of being alone in that house, afraid of proving to herself that 15 years of choosing him over me had been a mistake she could never undo. And it's a strange kind of grief to feel sorry for someone and furious at them in the exact same breath. Vanessa eventually scheduled a formal mediation session, hoping it might put an end to things without a courtroom. And I agreed mostly because I wanted a professional record of exactly how unreasonable Roger's demands were. He showed up with a manila folder, the same kind of folder he'd once used to collect my rent money as a teenager, except this one was stuffed with a handwritten, itemized list totaling $47,000, charges going back over a decade for things like clothing contribution, bedroom usage fee, and grocery allotment, an attempt to retroactively invoice me for the privilege of having existed in his house as a child. The mediator, a woman with about 30 years of family law experience written into the lines on her face, read through the list without changing expression, then told Roger plainly that parents have a legal duty to support minor children, that what he'd described charging a 16-year-old rent and putting an 18-year-old out on the street 2 weeks after graduation sounded a great deal like financial exploitation and housing instability inflicted on a minor and a barely adult, not a debt owed to him, and that continuing to pursue money from me under these circumstances could reasonably be characterized as harassment. Roger's face went red. He accused the mediator of being biased against him, gathered his folder, and walked out of the session without another word, and that was the last time I ever sat in a room with him. Vanessa walked me out to the parking lot afterward and told me, with the kind of matter-of-fact confidence that only comes from decades of watching people like Roger fold under scrutiny, that in her experience, the loudest demands usually came from the weakest legal positions, and that everything we just watched happen in that conference room was going to work entirely in my favor if he ever actually followed through on his threat to sue. A few days later, my mother's phone lit up my screen with a text that Roger had clearly typed himself, something about karma coming for ungrateful daughters, and I took a screenshot, sent it straight to Vanessa, and then did something I'd been putting off for weeks, which was block my mother's number entirely for a while. Not out of cruelty, but because I genuinely needed a stretch of time where nobody in that house could reach me at all, where I could just breathe without waiting for the next guilt trip text or threatening voicemail. It turned out I didn't have to wait very long for the ending to write itself. About 4 months after the mediation fell apart, Roger's landscaping company filed for bankruptcy. The commercial contracts he'd been counting on never materialized. His equipment got repossessed one truck at a time, and from what I understand through the grapevine of people who still talk to my mother, he's been picking up odd contracting jobs ever since to make ends meet. My mother managed to keep the house, thank God, since the mortgage application never went through, but she's been dealing with real financial strain since then, and I heard, secondhand, that she finally started seeing a therapist of her own, which I hope is true, and I hope helps her, even if I'm not the one who gets to see the results of it up close anymore. A cousin who still keeps in touch with both of them told me my mother sold the good china that used to sit in the dining room hutch to cover a few months of expenses after Roger's business collapsed, and I felt a strange, complicated pang hearing that not quite pity and not quite satisfaction, something in between that I still haven't found a clean word for. As for me, the last several months have looked nothing like the 2 years before them. I got promoted to senior accountant at my firm in the spring, a promotion I'd been working toward long before any of this started, and one that had nothing to do with the money and everything to do with showing up and doing good work, even while my personal life was on fire behind the scenes. My director pulled me into her office to tell me the news and said she'd noticed, over the previous few months, that I'd somehow gotten more focused rather than less under pressure, and I didn't tell her why, just thanked her and went back to my desk where Derek had predictably already left a celebratory coffee waiting. I set up an irrevocable trust with Marcus's help so that no future version of my winnings would ever be vulnerable to this kind of pressure again, structured in a way that protects it for the rest of my life, regardless of what anyone in my family might try next. I took myself on a 2-week trip to Ireland in June, something I'd dreamed about since I was a kid reading library books about castles I never thought I'd actually get to see, and I stood on a cliff in County Clare and cried for reasons that had nothing to do with Roger or my mother at all. Just the sheer relief of being somewhere so far removed from the last 15 years of my life. I sent Jasmine a photo from that cliff, the wind wrecking my hair, and she wrote back 3 words, "You made it." And I sat with those words for a long time afterward because they felt truer and more earned than almost anything anyone had said to me in years. I paid quietly and without being asked to have Dottie Whitfield's roof replaced and her plumbing redone. The same woman who rented me a room for less than she should have when I was 18 and had nowhere else to go. Because some debts are worth repaying even when nobody's forcing you to. Dottie cried when the contractors showed up, insisted she didn't need charity, and I had to remind her gently that she'd never once treated the rent I paid her at 18 as charity going the other direction, that she'd fed me dinner most nights, I couldn't afford groceries, and never once mentioned it, and that this was simply the ledger finally balancing itself out after 11 years. And maybe the thing I'm proudest of, more than the trust or the trip or the promotion, is that I partnered with a small nonprofit run by a woman named Renata, whose brother happened to be a friend of Derek's, to launch a scholarship fund specifically for young people who've aged out of unstable or unsupportive homes, kids who worked overnight shifts and took night classes the way I did, kids who never had anyone slide $200 into their palm on the way out the door, let alone a fraction of a lottery jackpot. We've funded 6 scholarships so far, small ones, a few $1,000s each toward tuition, or a security deposit, or a reliable car, but every time an email comes in from one of those kids thanking us, I think about 18-year-old me standing on Dottie's porch with a duffel bag and $200, and I think this is what that money was actually for. I don't talk to Roger anymore, and I doubt I ever will again. My relationship with my mother is thinner now than it used to be, not non-existent. We still talk occasionally, but I've stopped waiting for her to become someone she's shown me, over and over, she isn't willing to be. I used to think forgiveness meant things going back to how they were, and I've had to learn, slowly, and with a lot of help from Dr. Foster, that it doesn't have to mean that at all. I can't change my mother. I can't change what Roger did to me between the ages of 14 and 18, and I definitely can't change the fact that he saw my good fortune as an invoice with his name on it, rather than something to be happy for me about. What I can do, and what I've spent the last 11 months proving to myself I'm capable of, is build a life that's entirely mine, funded by my own decade of overnight shifts and night classes and one lucky scratch ticket, surrounded by the people who actually showed up for me, Dottie and Derek and Vanessa and a handful of strangers whose gratitude emails sit in a folder I reread on hard days, and honestly, that's more than enough. That's everything, actually.